A little over 16 years ago, a toolmaker in North Haven, Connecticut, walked into a mandatory 3:30 meeting he thought was about scheduling. He had spent 19 years on the line. He came out of that meeting with a date on it. The plant would phase him out over the next 18 months, along with 265 of his co-workers. Outside the building, the machines that cut Marlin barrels kept running because the order to shut down had a schedule of its own, and the schedule was longer than the goodbye. Remington did not walk into North Haven and take a rifle. Remington took something that could not be crated as easily. It took a working town, a name that had been earned on a bench for 138 years. And it emptied both into a truck bound for Ilion, New York, without asking the town's permission and without leaving its name behind. Most stories about a company being swallowed end with the smaller name disappearing quietly, folded into a catalogue page and forgotten. This one does not end quietly. It ends in a bankruptcy courtroom in Alabama, with the Marlin name being sold off in pieces to the highest bidder. And that is what makes it harder to look away from than the ones that end quietly. Remington and its parent company profited from the Marlin name for over a decade. The man who built that name, and the 4 generations of workers who kept it running after him, received none of that profit when it was finally converted back into cash. That is not an accident of business. That is the entire shape of the deal from the moment the ink dried in December of 2007. New Haven, Connecticut, 1863. A machinist named John Mahlon Marlin has just left his post at the Colt Armory, where he spent the years of the Civil War building revolvers for a country that did not yet know if it would survive itself. He has no factory. He has no investors. He has a set of hand tools, a rented room, and a sign that reads Pistol Maker, which he nails outside his own door because no one else is going to nail it there for him. He is 27 years old. He is not building for glory. He is building because the alternative is going back to working another man's bench for another man's wage, and he has already decided he would rather starve on his own terms. He starts small on purpose, because small is what he can afford. Single-shot derringers. Pocket pistols for men who cannot afford a Colt and do not need one. He sells them one at a time out of a shop with his own name over the door at a moment when half of Connecticut is trying to do the same thing and most of them will fail within 5 years. Marlin does not fail. By 1872 he has expanded beyond pistols into a broader line of firearms, and the operation is large enough to need a name that sounds like a company instead of a man. Marlin Firearms Company is what goes on the letterhead that year. He is not yet the man history remembers. He is a machinist with a sign and a debt to no one but himself, and he will spend the rest of his working life turning that sign into something his own sons could not have imagined the day he nailed it up. He would spend the rest of his life proving that a man with a bench and a sign owed nothing to the men who told him it could not be done. Marlin did not stumble into the lever action business. He bought his way in with judgment. In 1875, he secured rights to the Ballard single-shot design and refined it for hunters instead of soldiers. Refinement was not decoration. It was survival in a market crowded with better-funded rivals. By 1881, Marlin had introduced the Model 1881, the company's first true lever-action repeater, chambered for cartridges strong enough to compete directly with Winchester. Winchester was not a competitor Marlin could out-advertise. Winchester had capital. What Marlin had was a side-ejecting action that threw its empties clear of the top of the receiver instead of out through it, which meant a man could mount a scope flat and low on a Marlin in a way he never could on a Winchester of the same era. The problem was that scopes were still uncommon on hunting rifles in 1881. So Marlin built the better answer to a question most of the market had not started asking yet. What mattered in 1881 was that a man in New Haven had built a rifle strong enough, accurate enough, and clever enough in its ejection pattern to survive against the best-funded gunmaker in America. At a moment when scopes were still rare enough on hunting rifles that the advantage would not fully pay off for another generation. Marlin did not have Winchester's money. He had a mechanism nobody else had bothered to solve, and he was willing to wait for the market to catch up to it. New Haven, Connecticut, 1881 through the 1890s. Marlin is now running a real factory floor, and the work he is known for is not glamorous. He is grinding tolerances by hand on machines that do not yet have the precision modern shops take for granted. He buys rights where he needs to, most notably from an inventor named Andrew Burgess, whose patents Marlin licensed and built on to develop the company's first truly successful repeating rifle. The exact terms of that arrangement are not preserved in the record available today, but the pattern of the era is well documented. A 19th-century gun trade ran on outright purchase of a design, not on royalties running for decades. Once the rights changed hands, the buyer owned what he bought outright, forever, with no further obligation to the seller. By the 1890s, the Marlin Model 1893 and Model 1895 were on dealer shelves nationwide. Chambered for the 45-70 and other serious cartridges Winchester's lighter-framed guns could not safely handle. Marlin has built something Winchester has to answer, not the other way around. The company survives the death of its founder in 1901, survives a chaotic ownership fight through the 1920s, and is finally caught at auction in 1924 by a lawyer named Frank Kenner, who pays $100 for the company, along with a mortgage nearly 1,000 times that size. The Kenner family will run Marlin for the next 83 years. 4 generations under one roof, one name, one river town. North Haven, Connecticut, and Ilion, New York, 2007. Cerberus Capital Management, a private equity firm with no history of building a rifle and no intention of learning how, is assembling something it calls the Freedom Group. The strategy is not craftsmanship. The strategy is consolidation, the same strategy applied across a dozen unrelated industries by the same kind of firm in the same decade. Buy the name. Buy the customer loyalty attached to the name. Strip the overhead the name is sitting on. Cerberus already owns Remington Arms, a company with a longer history than Marlin's, but a weaker foothold in lever guns. In December of 2007, Cerberus purchased Marlin Firearms outright, folding a 135-year-old family company into a portfolio that also includes ammunition makers, other gun brands, and eventually a private security contractor. A man working the line at a Freedom Group plant in the late 2000s has something his father did not have: a steady paycheck in a shrinking American manufacturing sector. A house in North Haven he is still paying down. A hunting rifle in the closet that says Marlin on the barrel because his father carried one and his grandfather carried one before that, and buying anything else would have felt like a small betrayal. He does not know what Cerberus is. He does not need to know. He knows that the company that signs his check now has a different name on the letterhead than it did 5 years ago, and he has been told more than once that nothing is going to change for him. Something changes for him within 3 years. Remington announces in April of 2008 that it will close the Gardner, Massachusetts plant Marlin had acquired only years earlier, ending 200 jobs before the ink on the original sale is even dry. Then, in March of 2010, Remington announced the North Haven plant itself will close, phasing out 265 workers over 18 months and moving the tooling to Remington's own facilities in Ilion, New York and Mayfield, Kentucky. The Marlin name is not on either of those buildings. The Marlin name will stay on the barrel of the rifle. It will not stay on the building where that rifle used to be born. What Remington actually purchased in 2007, when the transaction was stripped down to what changed hands, was a brand, a customer base built over 135 years, and a set of tooling and patents that could be physically relocated. What the company did not purchase, and did not need to purchase, was the town of North Haven, the multi-generational workforce that had built Marlin's reputation cut by cut on that specific factory floor, or the Kenner family's 83 years of continuity. Those things had no line item. Nobody wrote a check for the accumulated skill of a workforce that had spent careers learning one factory's specific machines. The tooling moved. The people did not move with it. No transition package tied to years of service beyond the legal minimum. No public accounting of what that specific workforce's knowledge had been worth to the balance sheet Cerberus was building. No promise on the name staying in Connecticut. No paperwork obligating the buyer to anything beyond the assets it had already decided to keep. Marlin's employees had operated for generations inside a 19th century understanding of what a factory job meant. Loyalty ran in both directions. A man's father worked the floor, so the man worked the floor, and the company's obligation to him was assumed rather than written down, because it had never needed to be written down under family ownership. Cerberus was not operating inside that understanding. Cerberus was operating inside a private equity understanding, where a workforce is a line item to be optimized like any other, and the assumption of mutual obligation that had governed North Haven for generations carried no weight at all in a spreadsheet built in New York. Remington, under Cerberus and its Freedom Group umbrella, controlled the Marlin name and its product line for 13 years, through the 2010 closure, through a bankruptcy filing in 2018, through a brief and troubled restructuring, and into a second and final bankruptcy in 2020. Remington got a name recognized across 4 generations of American hunters. Remington got a lever-action product line it did not have to develop from scratch. North Haven got 18 months of notice and a moving truck. You already know how this part goes. You have read this story before under a different company's name, in a different decade, about a different American town. You have always known which side of that ledger the workers end up on. What you may not have known is that the name on the barrel of your own rifle, if you own one, may carry a town's whole working history inside it that nobody thought was worth writing down. Ilion, New York, 2018. Remington Outdoor Company, the renamed successor to the Freedom Group, files for bankruptcy protection for the first time, buried under debt taken on during the private equity years and battered by a sales collapse the company had not planned for. It survives, barely restructured under new creditors. The survival does not last. In July of 2020, Remington files again, and this time there is no restructuring. There is only an auction. Federal bankruptcy court in the Northern District of Alabama oversees the liquidation of a company that once called itself America's oldest gunmaker, selling off its ammunition division, its Remington-branded firearms, and the Marlin name in separate lots to separate bidders like furniture at an estate sale. Vista Outdoor takes the ammunition business for roughly $81 million. Sturm Ruger and Company, a rival gunmaker with no lever-action heritage of its own, wins the Marlin lot for $28.3 million, with its own chief executive telling the press the opportunity was too great to pass up. That sum is what 150 years of continuous American manufacturing, 4 generations of family ownership, a Civil War-era machinist's original sign, and the loyalty of a workforce that had operated a single factory town's worth of institutional memory finally sold for, once it was reduced to line items in a bankruptcy filing. The name alone, separated entirely from the town that built it, was worth more to Ruger's future than the purchase price suggested. Ruger did not buy North Haven. North Haven had already been gone for 9 years by the time the gavel came down. Ruger bought a name that had survived its own factory's death and was still, somehow, worth paying for. The machines that once stood in North Haven had already made their second move by then, trucked from Ilion and Mayfield to Ruger's plant in Myodan, North Carolina, 645 miles from the Ilion facility alone. A route with no relation at all to New Haven, where a machinist had nailed up a rented room's first sign more than a century and a half earlier. Quality had suffered through the Remington years in ways long-time owners noticed immediately: uneven finishing, function issues that would have been unthinkable under Kenner family ownership, complaints that piled up across shooting forums faster than Remington's customer service could answer them. Whatever institutional knowledge the North Haven machinists had carried in their hands did not travel with the tooling. It stayed in Connecticut, in workers who had scattered into other trades within 18 months of that 3:30 meeting. Most of them never touching a Marlin receiver again for the rest of their working lives. A rifle safe in a hunter's garage right now holds a lever-action rifle bought 2 years ago for a hunting trip that has been rescheduled twice. Once for a daughter's wedding and once for a knee surgery that took longer to heal than anyone expected. The owner tells himself the trip is still coming. That rifle carries a Marlin roll mark on its barrel, made not in North Haven and not even in Ilion, but on CNC equipment in Myodan, North Carolina, under a company that had never made a lever gun before it bought the wreckage of one that had. That rifle exists because a machinist in Myodan learned a process from a manual, not from a foreman who learned it from his own father on that specific factory floor. That process exists because Ruger paid $28.3 million for the right to use a name built over 150 years by people none of whom received a share of that sale. And that name exists at all because a young man in 1863 decided a hand-painted sign and a rented room were reason enough to bet on himself. The rifle has never once failed a hunter who understood what it was built to do. That much of the original promise survived every single sale. A model number on a receiver cannot explain why a factory town grieves the way North Haven grieved through that phased 18-month layoff. The workers were not owed a pension beyond what the law required. And the law required very little. But something had been assumed for 83 years under Kenner ownership, an unwritten understanding that a family name over the door meant a family obligation to the people underneath it. Cerberus never signed on to that understanding, because Cerberus had never been asked to, and no court in Alabama was going to retroactively enforce a handshake that predated the paperwork by nearly a century. That is the quiet mechanism underneath every version of this story, in every industry it happens to. The old obligation dies first, quietly, years before the factory does. The factory closing is just the part everyone finally notices. 2 hunters sit at a camp table on the opening morning of deer season, arguing the way hunters always argue, about whether the new Ruger-built Marlins are as good as the old Connecticut guns, or whether nostalgia is doing all the talking. One of them has his grandfather's Model 336, built in North Haven before the closure, the receiver worn smooth by 3 generations of hands. The other has a new Model 1895 built in Myodan, tighter tolerances, better finish. No history behind it yet, because the history has not had time to happen. Neither one knows the toolmaker who left that 3:30 meeting in 2010 with 18 months on his job and no severance tied to years served. Both of them paid the current owner of that name for the privilege of having this argument at all. And neither company that sold them the rifle in their hands ever cut a check to the town that actually built the reputation both men are arguing about. The Marlin name says 150 years of continuous American craftsmanship. The receiver in a hunter's hands says something else entirely, welded together out of North Haven tooling, Ilion labor, Myodan engineering, and a bankruptcy court's gavel. Marlin, Kenner, 265 names from a phased layoff list that was never printed in any company history. They built the argument two strangers are still having at a camp table. Not one of them got a share of what it finally sold for.